Two girls missing for 4 years, until a canine barked at the abandoned cellar next door. What if the cold knew a secret before anyone else? Snow Needles, Elmwood Lane, as a black and tan German shepherd stops dead, leash snapping tight, breath curling like smoke from a buried flare. December 17, 2023. Millbrook Falls, Minnesota. A retired detective named Clara Evans, 58, widowed, childless, haunted, walks Duke past the abandoned Presbyterian church she promised to ignore. For 4 years he has halted here. Today he digs nails, rake ice. Clara kneels, Duke's paws claw a ridge beside the foundation. She shovels and finds a cellar hatch. New hinges gleam beneath flaking paint. The latch lifts, air rises metallic and old, the kind that tastes like pennies and prayers. A beam cuts downward. Beds, quilts, a chalkboard lined with careful letters, 2 faces. 2 quick gasps. Ava and Ellie Harper, missing since Christmas Eve, 2019. Hair braided, cheeks pale, spines straight like they are waiting for a bell that never rings. Are you angels? One asks. Clara swallows instead of saying yes. They weren't kidnapped by a monster, they were raised by one. The name they whisper still earns blessings on Sundays. Grandpa James, the beloved ex-pastor, built a world 30 feet down. Kitchen, classroom, bedroom, and crowned himself savior. He told them the world ended in a flood. Your mom died. I saved you, you're the chosen ones. For 1460 days, they believed him. For 1460 nights, they learnt his gospel. Until Duke barked. Until Clara opened the door. Now answer this. Who left fresh chalk on the board today? Who set a table for 3? Why does Duke know? This scent like family. What happens next will break your heart, and then rebuild it. Stay to the final minute. Beat drop. Title card slams. 2 girls missing for 4 years. Until a canine barked at the abandoned cellar next door. Clara Evans wakes before dawn in a farmhouse that outgrew its family, too big and too quiet. She is 58, and winter counts the years for her. Knees that click, shoulders that argue, and a breath fogging the pain, while the boiler rattles awake. Maple Crest lies quiet outside, fields stiff with frost. Floorboards groan along her route from kettle to cupboard to table. She grinds beans and waits for the kettle to sing. The habit predates retirement, and the case that refuses to end. Every morning she pours 2 coffees. 1 cup goes to her place, where a legal pad waits with the day's first line. The other she sets across from her, steam drifting toward an empty chair. Her husband was a firefighter who ran into towers on a day that swallowed sirens. He never came back from New York. Years later, leukemia took their daughter at 16. The ritual remains, a pledge to the people time did not return. Duke pads in and sits by her knee. Black and tan, chest like a barrel, eyes steady. He carries the discipline of a soldier, because he was one. He came to her after a handler in Afghanistan, wrote a letter that reads like a folded prayer. The handler did not outlive his war. Duke did, and at sunset he lifts his head and howls, gathering lost names. She scratches his ruff, sets his bowl down, and feels the day take shape around care. The radio mutters weather about icy routes into Millbrook Falls. She turns the volume low. On the table sit folders bound by a tired band. The top page shows 2 little girls in winter hats. The poster corners curled. She taped them flat. She reviews notes she knows by heart. The gate was open at 5:15. The snowman was half finished. There were no footprints. A neighbor was watching from her window. And there was a scream at dusk when a mother saw what was not there. She speaks her mantra, because words in air hold. These tired bones still know when something's wrong. She dresses for the cold. Layers scarf, knit cap, gloves and boots with gouged soles. She clips Duke's leash and opens the back door. Clean air slides over the threshold. They follow the lane toward town. Neighbors wave from pickup. She lifts 2 fingers from her glove. People know her story and give space, plus invitations she rarely accepts. She clears driveways after storms and leaves casseroles when a baby comes, or an elder passes. She is not avoiding community. She is arranging days to be useful. They reach the bend where the Presbyterian church hugs Elmwood. Stone darkened by decades, stained glass dulled by snow. The building squats against the wind. Duke slows at the side yard. He has done this almost every day for 4 years. He sniffs the foundation, traces the contour along the ground, and rests a paw against a drift that never holds shape. He freezes and looks up, eyes bright with intent. She studies the frame, door seams, hinge plates, boards that do not match their age, and a sheen that means oil, where rust should be. She circles the lot with him. Tire tracks on the side street lift, curve, back and settle. Someone reversed neatly, as if avoiding a camera. She photographs the pattern and angles the lens to pull detail from shadows. Footprints by the parsonage steps appear, blur and vanish. Under new powder, enough remains to show a person stood and waited. A parish volunteer unlocks the north door and offers a way. Clara asks about a roof repair from 3 winters ago. The woman recalls a contractor who painted a patch and later returned, claiming he forgot a tool. No invoice the second time, no logo remembered. Clara notes the uncertainty and keeps her tone gentle. She will check record. Duke noses the stone again and gives a frustrated sound that pinches her heart. They walk home by a different route. She stops at a small market and buys rock salt and windscreen fluid. She asks whether any unmarked vans were parked near the church last week. The clerk names a day and mentions a driver who bought coffee and exacted change with gloved hands. No decals, ladder rack empty. Clara thanks her and steps back into the cold. Duke shakes once, then heals without command. Back at the farmhouse she logs times and places. The kitchen clock keeps ticking. She flips through permits, cross-checks deliveries, and highlights invoices tied to Elmwood. She calls the precinct for a contact list of contractors who serviced the roof and basement plumbing. A young sergeant promises names by noon. Respect hums through his voice. She sets the phone down with a faint smile she rarely shows. Afternoon brings wind off the river, in a gray sky that shortens distance. She lays out gear by the door. A flashlight, extra batteries, a narrow crowbar, graphite, evidence bags and a pen. She rehearses the sequence she once drilled. Look, listen, sniff, knock, pause, decide. Duke shadows her from room to room, nails clicking, tail sweeping cabinets. He brings a rope and waits. She tugs once, points at the mat and he sits. Evening settles early. She shrugs into a heavier coat and steps outside. Temperature slides, snow squeaks underfoot, windows glow across the valley. She feels the pull between staying where grief is choreographed and walking where questions gather. She chooses the second, because purpose does not wait. They reach the church again under a slate sky. Duke's ears lift. He moves with the economy she recognizes from drills. He guides her along the side yard to the place where the foundation dips. He stops. The leash goes. His body stills so completely that she feels a decision settle inside her like a coin touching the bottom of a well. She kneels, sweeps aside powder, and finds wood that does not match its frame. Fresh grain under flaking paint, and faint oil on hinge pins. Easy, she tells him. We do this right. She shines the light along the seam, and listens to wind rake the steeple. She does not pry, not tonight. She photographs, measures, and writes the time. Timing matters as much as discovery. Without cause, she can be blocked. With cause, she can move mountains. Back home she sets the crowbar by the door and the flashlight on the table beside the legal pad. She pours water into the kettle again, fills 2 mugs and sits. The second mug steams and cools as Duke rests his head on her foot. She says the words once more, not for comfort, but for alignment with the person she has always been. These tired bones still know when something's wrong. The house breathes around her. Outside, the wind leans against the siding. Tomorrow will make use of the ledger she has made. Before bed, she checks the back door, dims the kitchen light and listens to quiet that is not silence. She dreams about keys multiplying on a ring, until they chime like wind bells. She wakes before the sound completes, pours 2 coffees, clips Duke's leash, and checks her pocket for the flashlight and graphite. The day will ask for patience. She has patience to spare. She also has a partner who refuses to let the wrong place stay quiet. Together they turn toward Elmwood, toward the church that guards a secret, toward the door that does not quite belong to. Christmas Eve 2019 arrived like a held breath over Millbrook Falls. Lydia Harper pushed through her side door with a canvas tote, a thermos, and a knot between her shoulders that never untied after long shifts. She was 29, a nurse who had learned to move with careful economy when rooms shook, a widow after cancer erased the future she and her husband had traced, and a mother whose heart spoke because it beat in time with two smaller hearts. She hung her parka, toed off her boots, and peered through the kitchen window toward the yard she had salted at dawn. Ava and Ellie were exactly where she had imagined them while charting vitals, bundled in bright jackets and palm hats, mittens flashing like little flags, boots stamping constellations across the lawn. A sled sat beside them, half buried, and a snowman rose half finished. The base leaned a little but held. The second sphere waited on the sled, ready to roll into place. Cheeks pink, eyes bright, the twins pressed and patted until the surface shone. The carrot nose rested on the porch rail next to two blue bottle caps and a pair of battered buttons. Across the fence, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks watched from her kitchen window, a tea mug cupped against her ribs, steam slipping along the glass like a thin veil. At 78 she moved more slowly now, but her gaze still pinned down trouble before it stood up. Mrs. Brooks lifted a mittened hand in a small, ordinary benediction. Lydia waved back with gratitude. 5 minutes, Lydia called through the cracked door, letting a sliver of warmth comb the cold. Then cocoa. She reached for the carrot and set it back beside the bottle caps. The house smelt nutmeg because she had primed the slow cooker before sunrise. 2 small presents hid behind flour canisters. She wanted baths, pajamas, marshmallows, and a movie. Tonight needed to be easy. Wind nudged the back gate. The lower latch had been loose for weeks. The upper hook still held, though Lydia kept meaning to replace it with something that wouldn't shrug in a storm. The street beyond murmured with holiday errands. A delivery truck idled, then glided away. Mr. Spajamas, Brooks tipped her chin toward the alley in her habitual signal that she was keeping watch. Lydia touched her fingers to her brow in a grateful salute and lifted the camera she had started carrying again. "Hold still," she said softly, and the girls tried hard while flakes tickled their eyelashes. The shutter clicked. Ava whispered that the snowman needed a noble name. Ellie proposed Sir Frostington the Brave. Lydia saluted the unfinished guardian and promised a promotion after supper. She stepped inside for cocoa, leaving the door open an inch. The kettle gathered itself on the stove. She rinsed 2 chipped mugs, set out marshmallows, and rubbed a circle clear in the fogging window to keep an unbroken line to the yard. The twins bent together over the sled, working the second sphere with synchronized seriousness, faces flushed with achievement. The world beyond them felt gentle. The breath ended when wind ran down the alley with a narrow hiss. The back gate tapped the post and settled. Lydia frowned at the familiar clink and promised her future self she would fix it before New Year's. Cat leapt onto the fence and made a question mark of his tail, testing the air. Mrs. Brooks, framed by her own window, raised a hand and pointed once toward the street, the neighbor's shorthand for a truck that had paused and then gone. Lydia nodded. 2 minutes, she called. The kettle shivered toward a whistle. She measured cocoa and looked through the clear circle on the glass. For a second she didn't understand what had shifted. The picture was almost the same, only thinner. The sled sat where it had been, the unfinished sphere still nested on top. The scarf lay in the snow with one end folded like a bookmark. The carrot remained on the rail. The yard displayed every earlier boot crater, little moons. No new prints stitched those stars to the gate, the alley, or the shadowed strip behind the lilac. Silence pooled. Ava. She tried calm first. Ellie. She slid the door wide and stepped onto the porch. The world snapped into focus. The set of snow at the base of the snowman, the exact pattern where boots had bounced and stopped. No trail led away. No skids, drags, or playful scuffs broke the sheen. She checked behind the lilac, swept the space under the porch with her eyes, and opened the shed. Nothing. She called again, louder now, letting their names ring toward the alley. A muted hush answered. She went to the gate. The lower latch dangled broken. The upper hook hung loose. Gate open. She studied the snow dusting the alley. It lay clean, a perfect sheet that would have tattled about any recent passage. She looked for tracks. Nothing. Behind her, the scarf waited, set down carefully. That detail frightened her more than the emptiness. Mrs. Brooks' latch clicked, and her porch light cut across the fence. "Everything all right?" she called, voice thin but steady. Lydia shook her head and felt something tear low under her ribs. She wanted more eyes, more ears, a miracle. She paced the yard and the porch, drawing smaller circles, until she stood at the center. Inside, the kettle began to keen, the thin cry of metal they had heard since infancy. The sound punctured the fragile control she had been stitching. Cat jumped down and threaded her shins, meowing once,
"Call," Mrs. Brooks said when she reached the porch, one hand braced on the frame, the other already lifting toward Lydia's pocket. Lydia grabbed her phone from the charger, thumbed past the warning about low battery, and dialed numbers she knew by heart. Dispatch answered with practiced calm. She listed names, ages, jackets, hats, the yard, the snowman, the open gate, no footprints, and the time. She looked at the kitchen clock, 5:15 p.m. She said it aloud because time pins memory to the floor. Sirens woke somewhere beyond the river, thin at first, then gathering, stitching the gray air with red intention. Neighbors opened doors as if a silent signal had moved up the block. Faces turned toward Lydia's yard and mirrored her fear. The alley offered no story. The yard offered only contradiction. Joy stamped everywhere, direction stamped nowhere. The snowman waited, eyeless and mute. Lydia walked the perimeter again, then again, collecting details. The carrot's shadow on the rail, the scarf's unruffled fringe, a bottle cap shining in a tiny hollow. She pressed her palm to the fence post to steady her knees and told herself she had made a reasonable choice. 5 minutes becomes 3 when Coco is promised. A mother is allowed to breathe. A latch can be repaired tomorrow. It didn't matter. Absence had a sound, and it spoke. When her voice finally tore free, it was not for a checklist, not for a form or a script. It came from the same dark well that had opened the night cancer took the man who used to hold her hand through storms. It ripped at the cold, and hung there, sharp as ice. They just vanished.
Duke caught it first. A filament of scent curled up from the earth like steam off a hidden spring, and froze so hard the leash sang. Clara felt the stop in her shoulder before she saw where he pointed. The rear yard of the Presbyterian church, the side that the logged plows and plows forgot, and the wind never fully covered. He tracked the foundation with a hunter's patience, nose skimming frost, claws placing careful punctuation in the powder, then halted at a low rectangle pressed into the stone like a secret plows had learned to pretend. The leash went taut, his chest rose once, twice, then stilled. No growl, no whine, just certainty. She dropped to a knee. The wall wore the weary look of buildings that have outlived their choirs, mortar chewed by winters, seams sagging, but the wooden panel set into it told a different story. Paint flaked in thin curls under her glove, revealing grain too young for the folklore about sealed since learned flood. The flood. Her fingertips slid over hinge pins slick with fresh oil. Screws sat flush and unblemished. The planks themselves had the greenish cast of pressure treatment, beaded with the tiny pearls of melt that linger when care has visited recently. Someone had improved a door they wanted everyone to ignore. Clara let her breath even out and angled her flashlight to skim the seam. Crystals flared like ground glass. Something small winked back from the drift under the lower edge, a violet bruise against white that did not belong to stone or paint. She tucked the light under her chin, pulled off one glove, and pinched. Yarn came free with a delicate rasp. A purple mitten rested in her palm, hand knitted, seed stitches neat and dense, a slim stripe at flood, cuff, and the cuff, a little heart in pearl by the thumb, as if the maker had whispered love into the wool. Along the inner seam, sunlight-thin letters were stitched in pale thread. E.H. Her chest tightened. Ellie Harper had worn a pair just like this in the photograph Lydia carried like a talisman, the twins laughing in mismatched cuff and colors, ched colors, faces bright, a carrot clamped between their teeth because proper noses were colors later. For later. The mittens outside was lightly damp, crusted with the faintest rime. Inside, the wool held a breath of trapped warmth, dry where the door had shielded it. It hadn't lain here long. Snow spun through her beam and drifted past her face like prayer ash. She spoke to the recorder clipped beneath her scarf, steadying herself with the discipline that had seen her through nights when grief wanted to unmake language. Rear of church, Elmwood Lane. Later. The subgrade access panel appears maintained. Found item, child's mitten, purple, hand-knit seed stitch, cuff stripe, initials E.H. stitched inside. Probable owner, Ellie Harper. Exterior damp, interior dry, recent. Photographing, bagging. Saying it aloud put the moment into a frame she could carry. Duke leaned, inhaled, and traced the seam with the tip of his nose, breath slipping under the wood in silky puffs. He lifted a paw, placed it near the latch, then met her eyes with the bright plea of a partner whose body knows the answer before the human writes the question. "Wait," she murmured, smoothing the ruff where the coat thickened over his shoulder. She took wide shots, then tight, then a reference frame with a quarter by the hinge, follow it the subgrade the ritual like a spell. The mitten slid into an evidence bag, air pressed out, see the ritual zipped, and lead zipped, time noted in block letters that never shook. She studied the hardware again. The hinge plates weren't only new, they were chosen with car zipped and galvanized steel. Galvanized steel, edge filing clean, no flecks of corrosion where fasteners met grain. The latch barrel showed a bright rub, the kind of crescent that comes from a key that knows exactly which way to turn. Maintenance had hands, maintenance had intention. Clara widened her circle to the galvanized tirade lane. Tire ruts arced in,
paused, then retraced themselves out in a neat reversal tire. Minimized tracks, the sort of careful driving that comes from practice rather than luck. Powder had softened edges, but not the pattern. Near the fence post, a small depression hinted at a boot testing balance, then pulling back. On a stone ledge no one notices, a chalk-thin scrape suggested the corner of a plastic bin had bumped and gone still. She knelt and listened. Wind ran a cold finger up the steeple. Far off, someone's shovel tapped a rhythm. A crow stitched a black line across the sky and vanished. Everything ordinary. This door insisted otherwise. Easy, she told herself, because the word worked like a hand on her own shoulder. The record she'd requested would land before dusk. Contractors, deliveries, permits, invoices that claimed one thing while the hardware claimed another. She could step back, draft an affidavit, and return with a judge's ink and a unit to hold the perimeter. Or she could lift the latch and let a beam fall. Minimized rumor, where rumor had lived for 30 winters. Law and timing nipped at her wrists like the cold sneaking into a sleeve. She chose rumor, patience, and felt the pinch of it. The cemetery beyond the wall hunched in quilts. Names wore snow masks. A gust lifted a drift from one stone and laid it on another like a borrowed shawl. She imagined a small hand reaching the seam, leaving a signal for anyone brave enough to see. Or a caretaker who had decided at last to tilt the scale toward mercy. Either way, a mitten at this door meant contact with air, with hope, with the idea of an above. She rested her palm lightly against the panel, not pushing, only sharing warmth. Wood answered with a faint creak that felt almost shy, a structure unused to kindness. Hunger rose in her to pry, to cut, to take the shortest line between suspicion and light. She swallowed it and took one more photograph of each screwhead, because discipline turns heat into action, and action into proof. The flashlight clicked off. She tucked the bagged wool into an inner pocket by the place she kept her ID. If you've ever lost hope, imagine finding it in a mitten. Drop a heat in the comments if this gave you chills. The words slipped out softly, not as a stunt but as the true breath of a woman who had counted too many empty chairs and still believed in the arithmetic of small signs. She didn't linger on them. She stepped forward as if she had never spoken. Next step, she told the mic, canvass adjacent homes. Verify any contractor returns. Check parsonage deliveries. Pull utilities for unusual draw, heat or ventilation below grade. Request discreet observation on the lane. She pictured Lydia somewhere across town, hands cupped around a phone, not hearing procedures, only a heartbeat tapping a name across 4 years. The side door of the church opened. A volunteer emerged with a yellow bucket of salt, blinked at the pair by the wall, and relaxed when Spatienson recognized Clara. They exchanged the shorthand of small towns that watch without prying. The woman remembered a painter who had come back months after a roof patch to touch something up that didn't need touching. No company name. Clean hands. Cash. Clara asked about keys for any lower rooms. Only the offices, the woman said, tapping her pocket. Downstairs was closed after a flood long before my time. That's what they told me. Both of them looked toward the panel without meaning to, as if a magnet set behind stone had nudged their chins. Clara thanked her and let the silence fold again. She crouched once more to record details people forget because they do not think to look. A splinter standing proud near the latch where a glove might snag. A swirl in the grain that resembled a comma, as if the wood itself meant to say more. Resin filling a knothole like amber catching winter light. Duke's breath fogged her sleeve. His pulse under her palm beat steady and ready, the metronome of a promise. She stood and gave the leash a little slack for the walk back. Duke resisted for a heartbeat, then matched her. She did not turn her back on the panel until the corner of Elmwood took it from view. When she finally faced forward, it was with the calm of someone who knows the world has tilted a degree and won't be coaxed level until the right door opens. At the farmhouse recognized labeled, she labeled and unlabeled, and logged a table turned into a map of neat squares in careful ink. The mitten's photograph slid under a clip. The bag itself nested where her hand could feel its weight. She wrote what it meant without letting the pen stall. Proof of presence, proof of movement, proof of care. Either a child had reached upward and left a flag, or someone down there had decided the story should change. Both possibilities made her eyes burn. She brewed coffee, poured 2 cups, and set one across from her out of habit, steam ghosting toward a chair that still belonged to a firefighter who never came home. Duke settled beneath the table, chin on paws, gaze pinned to the door as if waiting for a knock he could already hear. There's a door behind the church that pretends it's old, she said into the room's hushed attention. It isn't. There's a purple mitten that pretends it's forgotten. It isn't. The words hung like icicles that would not melt until morning broke. Night arrived early and absolute. She called a sergeant she trusted, reported the find, and requested surveillance that would not spook whoever tended that hidden mouth. She set her alarm for an hour before first light and laid her gear by the back door. Flashlight, spare batteries, graphite, fine pry bags, tags, gloves, and the quiet courage that comes from a dog who will not leave the wrong place alone. Somewhere under stained glass and snow, air moved along a thin seam where wood met stone. Somewhere in that dark a classroom waited, a kitchen breathed, and a bed remembered small shoulders. Dawn would bring records, dawn would bring cause, and when keys finally answered hinges, Clara vowed she would lift that panel not with anger but with the steadiness of someone who has been waiting 4 years to hear children breathe sky.
Clara's beam slipped down narrow steps and revealed a room arranged with deliberate care, a hidden world stitched beneath stone. A rug softened concrete. Shelves lined the walls, each labeled in pencil. Glass jars held beans, rice, oats, and peaches in syrup. A hot plate sat beside a dented kettle. 2 enamel mugs dried on a rack. The air carried bleach, cinnamon, and wool, as if someone tried to craft safety with order. To the left, a kitchenette compressed a life. A hand pump rose from a basin. Soap flakes filled a jar. A tin of cocoa sat by a box of tea, plates stacked with thrift. Above the counter, drawings had been taped to cinder block with blue strips. Wax crayon told one story again and again. 2 girls with joined hands, a bearded man beside them, an ark riding stylized waves, and pairs of animals marching with patience. To the right, a classroom waited. A chalkboard listed days of the week in big letters. A painted clock held its hands at 9. Crates held readers labeled with numbers, letters, plants, and stories. Pencils lay sharpened to points. A foil star hung above the board. Beyond a curtain pieced from old blocks, 2 narrow beds stood side by side. Quilts patterned with ships covered each mattress. Stitches steady, bindings neat, colors chosen with a child's generosity. On one pillow, a braided ribbon waited like a bookmark. On the other, a mended rabbit sat upright, one ear reinforced with navy thread. Between the beds, a crate served as a table. A jar of buttons glittered beside a candle shaped by patient nights. Clara found a journal on a shelf above the desks, its cover scuffed and corners rounded by years. An elastic band, tired yet faithful, held it shut. Inside, dates marched along margins in an adult's firm strokes, while entries alternated between clipped sentences and rounded script pressed deep into the fiber. She angled her light and read into her recorder, letting her voice steady her breath. "Ava, age 9, she said, then spoke the line in careful loops. "Grandpa James says we're safe. The flood took Mommy. We're building a new world." Duke leaned against her knee. She turned pages and watched seasons pass as drawings, icicles like teeth, saplings with green halos, leaves swirling into copper spirals, snow domes above a door called Hatch. Lessons were repeated with ritual devotion. Boil water twice, sing before meals, copy one sentence 10 times, while the adult hand added inventories, candles bundled for Sabbath, flour rotated, batteries tested, hinge oiled. Names of hymns appeared beside chores. Every line insisted on purpose and smuggled control. Clara walked the perimeter and narrated details. A vent pipe snaked along joists, foam wrapped, attached to a box fan wired with care yet wrong. A generator crouched inside a crate drilled with holes. Water drums stood along the back wall. A crate held candles sorted by length. A shoebox labeled treasures waited on a middle shelf. She untied the string and lifted the lid. Painted stones shaped like boats rested beside tiny paper stars folded with patience. She unfolded one. A wish said, "See the blue above." Another read, "Find Mommy." She set them back and returned to the curtain. Behind it, a small alcove contained a shower stall, a bucket, a line with clothespins, and a towel folded with ceremonial neatness. On a hook hung 3 dresses, 2 cardigans, and a heavy sweater sized for a man. Beneath them, small shoes lined up with toes pointed outward. The care flooded Clara with anger gentled by awe. Somebody had crafted comfort while enforcing a fantasy that erased sky. She logged that order can soothe without absolving. She sat at a stool and read the chalkboard. The same sentence had been copied in a child's hand. The world ended, and the Ark saved us. Each iteration grew steadier as weeks passed. The painted clock stayed at 9. She photographed quilts whose corners carried cross stitches with initials that matched the purple mitten seam. She shot crayons pared flat, glue caps scraped clean, and pencils worn to nubs. In the margin of a seed lesson, a small drawing hid. A house with 4 windows, a swing, a street lamp, and a dog bounding ahead. Her light touched a prayer card taped near the beds. The verse had been amended by hand to include flood and ark. An underline marked chosen. She could not unknow harm disguised as protection, and she would not ignore meals cooked, hair braided, quilts tucked, and lessons taught with patience. The log would hold both. She lifted the journal again, and read the child's sentence more softly. "Grandpa James says we're safe. The flood took Mommy. We're building a new world." She pictured Lydia's hands cupping faces that had learnt the wrong map. Winter sunlight would strike these quilts until color bloomed. She slid the journal into an evidence bag, pressed out air, sealed the zip, and wrote the time. Her voice lowered for the people who would watch and need permission to weep and keep listening. These girls grew up believing a lie. Comment Ark if you're crying right now. She let the call travel and moved on. Gently, Clara returned each object as she had found it. She swept the beam over the classroom, kitchen, beds, quilts, and the flotilla of Ark drawings. Duke stood at heel, gazed toward a low register where faint warmth threaded the chill. She pressed her palm to metal and felt a tremor, a weight shift beyond, then stillness. She took photographs, then traced the vent to a junction that vanished behind a block. Whoever tended this room believed invisibility could be engineered.
She resumed the inventory, counting candles, reading labels, and mapping the logic of a mind that rearranged fear into duty. She noted coils of rope, quilts rolled for cold nights, and a small sewing kit with needles cushioned in felt. She logged hymn sheets on heavy paper, and a Bible with starred pages beside Rain and Covenant. At the desk she photographed a list of rules, then slid it back. She looked at the beds, and imagined the nightly ritual: hair braided, quilts pulled to chins, lamps turned low, a hymn sung soft enough to hide from an invented sea. Clara circled once more, eyes sweeping for the thing that hides by being ordinary. She spotted a scrape on the floor near the ladder where a box had rubbed recently. Dust lay thinner there. The air held cinnamon recent enough to be active, not memory. Someone had polished hinges, set out mugs, and arranged lessons that would resume unless truth intervened. She clipped the camera to her vest, lifted the evidence bag, and said for the recorder that light had entered and would bring voices, laws, and open doors. Then she clicked off the lamp, stood still, and let darkness rest for a count that honored the children who had lived within it. When she raised the beam again, she aimed it at the clock and the chalked sentence one last time, not to surrender to despair, but to mark where a lie had lived before a bark, a mitten, and a woman's refusal to stop turned the world upstairs toward morning.
James Whittaker never called himself a thief. In the mirror above the bathroom sink, the man he faced still wore a pastor's gravity, the sloping shoulders of someone who had carried casseroles to widows and whispered prayers across hospital curtains. 72 winters had settled into his joints. Yet his hands stayed capable, knuckles swollen but obedient, fingers steady enough to stitch guilt into plans and name the result mercy. Millbrook Falls remembered homilies about covenant and shelter, about building on rock when waters rise. He remembered a stop sign on black ice and the sound a heart makes when it understands the world will not rewind. He was driving his daughter and granddaughter home from choir when the truck slid sideways, a quiet ballet across a glassy intersection. Headlights climbed from the cross street. A horn cut the hymn. Steel found steel. He lived. His daughter did not. The child in the back seat breathed for 2 slow days, while machines kept score in green numbers. He held a tiny hand and begged God to trade. Dawn answered with silence that felt like a locked door. He walked out of the hospital carrying a shoe that had no owner, and a prayer that had no end. Blame salted everything. He tried counseling, sat through a support group, clipped words like acceptance from pamphlets, and tucked them into a Bible. He preached fewer Sundays, then resigned with a letter that cited health and praised younger voices. Retirement left hours that multiplied shame. He sold a patch of timber his father had kept for hunting, converted savings, and welcomed quiet donations from parishioners who believed they were underwriting a roof repair on the old Presbyterian church. At his kitchen table he drafted a diagram with boxes for food, water, air, light, school, and song. If the world above could steal without warning, a man who had failed once could build a place where failure would not enter. Work crews came by daylight and installed footings, blocks, stabilizing blocks, tire joists and vent, stabilizing blocks, tire joists and vent, stabilizing blocks, tire joists and vent, stabilizing blocks, stabilizing learnt. James ordered pressure-treated boards, food-safe barrels, a hand pump, a generator, school supplies, quilts, readers, hymn sheets, candles, and a worn Bible with large type. Learnt, cold, to braid paracord, splice wire, seal concrete, and fold paper stars. 5 years turned excavation into home. Hinges met oil, drawers shut softly. A clock on the wall rested at 9, because 9 was before the call, before the siren, before a mother's coat fell from a chair, and no one lifted it again. Lydia Harper pushed a stroller past the parsonage, while her husband still fought an illness that took him by inches. James carried firewood to her fence, set casseroles on her porch, and prayed by name. When the man died, he told himself he would keep watch until the house remembered joy. The twins grew. They waved in bright coats, accepted peppermint drops, stabilizing learnt protection, to sing the doxology. He loved them with a hunger that frightened him, so he renamed Clearnt. Learnt, protection, awed and scald and said, dishin' and polished it until it shone like a virtue. On Christmas Eve he walked the alley to clear drifted snow. The gate at Lydia's yard tapped the post. The bottom latch sagged. The upper hook had slipped. Ava and Ellie rolled a second snowball, mittens bright with frost, cheeks pink, boots trampling constellations. I protection learnt to the lawn. Lydia called protection boa coco, protection called and said ton, called and said coco, and called and said coco. Waited. For a breath he stood inside the sound of laughter he would never hear again from his own. Fear and longing braided into certainty. If the world could steal daughters in a blink, he would not wait for another theft. He would save what the storm might want. He did not seize. He ushered. He knelt and said the flood had come fast, that Mommy would meet them at boat, and cocoa a boat, and oat meals, and that a storm demanded brave sailors. They knew him as the gentle ex-pastor with peppermints and stories. They took his hands. He led them along the alley to the hatch hidden by drift, swung the door he had sanded smooth, and guided them down a ladder whose rungs felt like pew rails. He closed the panel and believed he had rescued them from the same chaos that had devoured his blood.
The bunker rewarded devotion. He braided hair, copied spelling lists, fried oatmeal in butter and praised neat handwriting. He taught them to boil water twice, to sing beef boat, and meals and cocoa meals and memorize boat, and meals and alls meals and memorize sendries verses about covenant and rainbows. He rolled quilts and told ark tales until sleep came. Obedience required no bruises. Ritual carried its own gravity. When Dora's memorize rose, he polished hinges, rotated peaches and rewrote commandments. No stairs without grandpa, no hatch unless the Lord says. He taught them that sirens meant the waters churned, and that chosen hearts waited underground until the world learned its lesson. He watched Lydia through the surface like a man behind glass. She stapled posters. She wept on a porch rail. Search teams combed the river and woods. He prayed for her comfort while doubling down on his liturgy. He believed grief could learned out-organized. He believed love could be rebuilt from wood, wire and will. In a chapel corner he bolted a simple oak cross and lit a votive, then argued with the dark. Lord, you took, so I keep. Thunder did not answer. He took the silence as a kind of permission. Nights gathered a new conscience. He kept them safe by measures counted each evening. Candles topped off. Lessons copied. Storage inventoried. Once a week he climbed at midnight, opened the panel, and breathed air that tasted la judgment. Oat organized. Oat organized. Judgment. Ninth, conscience. High fear judgment. Knee wiped prints from high fear judgment. Ardware, noted Neeg judgment. High fear tracks and reversed down the doctor blocks. Tyrity regborn, neighbors would not wonder who visited. Diligence proved neighbors a blessing. The ledger in his head showed harm on one side and solace on the other. He rewrote captions until he could sleep, saved them from a blessing. Strangers, died, taught them. Strangers, died, kept them warm, and then preserved innocence from storms that had names. Then Duke pressed a paw beside the latch, and Clara Evans knelt. James saw the moment from the parsonage path while cleaning salt from his truck. A black and tan head, a taut leash, a beam of light skating the seam, a purple mitten rising into a gloved hand. Panic cinched tight. He slipped behind the tool shed and listened to the dog's breathing and the detective's careful narration. He admired her method even as terror planed the world into exits. He hurried home, washed his hands twice, folded hymn sheets, and descended with a lantern. Ava and Ellie looked up, pencils paused over arithmetic. He told them waters were rising again. The Ark must move to a higher harbor for a short season. Ava asked whether Mommy would meet them there. Ellie pressed the mended rabbit against her cheek and said she counseling, dreamed of a bell. He soothed them with the language that had anchored their days. Chosen, safe, new world. He packed quilts, the journal, crayons, hymn sheets, buttons in a tin, and a small cocoa box, then checked the crate he had cached years earlier in a cave that felt like a cathedral. The quarry sat a mile away, walls cold enough to keep prayers from curling. He had hidden supplies there for fire or discovery. In the final chamber he would light wicks, teach another lesson and wait until the town tired. He pictured a triumphant return, a sermon about vigilance, and a new rule that would sow fear tighter. He caught his reflection in a jar and startled at eyes he did not recognize. The man looking back had traded humility for certainty and called the exchange obedience. He steadied himself with the sentence he had leaned on too long. Saviors cannot afford tears. He guided the girls up the ladder and into the truck, closed the hatch with a palm that lingered, and glanced toward stained glass that dimmed streetlight into holy smudges. The engine turned. He whispered names, his daughter first, then the granddaughter buried under stone, then the twins he had recast as survivors rescued by a benevolent captain. He missed the patrol car easing to a stop a block away, and the neighbor on a dark porch reporting a familiar vehicle at a strange hour. Providence, he decided, still approved of subtle men who planned. He thought he was God. Comment if you've ever grieved so hard you broke. The ache belongs here. Grief can warp maps until roads spiral inward toward rooms without windows. James walked those corridors believing pain authorized control. He built a sanctuary around a wound and called it righteousness. A kinder man would have confessed. A braver man would have opened the hatch the first dawn a child said the word sky. When Clara reads his history she will recognize scenes that could undo steadier souls. A grandfather polishing hinges like relics, a builder soldering a vent with hands that shook only when the hymn ended, and a widower quoting covenant while locking doors he called arks. She will honor sorrow without pardoning harm. She will follow him into stone not for revenge but because truth must breathe. In the echoing chamber ahead candles will tremble, and a hymn will thin into pleading. There the story that began with black ice will meet a woman who refuses to mistake devotion for goodness, and a dog who remembers exactly whom he serves.
Sirens stitched the cold as James turned onto Hawthorne Road with the twins buckled in, quilts wrapped around their knees, and the mended rabbit tucked beneath Ellie's chin. Snow scrolled across the windshield knees, and windscreen and thin skeins, smearing streetlights into ribbons. He drove the old pickup with careful hands, easing over slick patches curb, windscreen learnt by muscle memory, seeing only the mission he believed heaven had assigned. Ava watched fence posts pass like metronomes. Ellie hummed a hymn because routine steadied breath. The lantern by James's boot knocked once against the mat and fell still. Storm is rising, he said, gentle as prayer. We'll be safe inside. Only for a little while. The girls nodded because trust had been rehearsed into reflex. Behind them, Millbrook Falls folded into drifts and silence, and the church's dark windows kept their secrets for 1 mile more. Clara left the yard with the purple mitten sealed in a bag against her chest and felt the afterimage of a motor fading into the alley. Duke set his paw beside the hinge and looked up with a plea that felt like a command. Fine, she said. He sprang to the curb, Colerne Twarb, nose cutting the air, tail a metronome of intent. She radioed a description, snapped his harness into the seat clip, and let him point the wheel. They caught a thread of exhaust at the corner, rode it past shuttered storefront curb, shop fronts and the diner's buzzing sign, then onto the county road where wind crawled the ditches and stars hid behind gauze. Her pulse kept time with Duke's breathing. She pictured Lydia's hands clenched around a phone, knuckles pale, hope and dread braided so tight they bit. Hawthorne Quarry waited west, a limestone scar veined with ice and a mouth that inhaled winter. James had worked there as a teenager, and knew every switchback, spur and goat path used for summer dares. He eased by the chained gate, rolled into shadow, killed the lights and sat with his palms on the wheel while breath fogged the cab. Brave sailors, he murmured. Harbors shop fronts, harbors near. Ava checked the sky, then Ellie, then the blank road and tightened her grip on the rabbit's ear. He coaxed them out and pulled quilts higher. Boots sank, squeaked and held. He led them along ruts his truck had cut on a warmer day when he cached supplies. The walls rose like pews carved from ice. They descended a switchback to a seam where rock opened into a tunnel. A lantern flared in his hand and cast a coin, Harbor's cone of light that rolled ahead into stone. The cave breathed damp and old. Clara braked by the gate and scanned the ground. Fresh tracks sliced toward the interior in a line even fatigue could follow. Duke lowered his muzzle, inhaled once, twice, then launched. She unclipped the leash. He ran low and true, turning where the scent bent, glancing back when the path forked, flicking his tail when she chose the correct branch. On the radio she asked a patrol car to block the service road and a deputy to wait wait in the fort the east cut. Snow whispered across the hood. Duke did not slow. The quarry swallowed sound. Duke threaded switchbacks without hesitation. Clara's boots found old steps etched into limestone by men with lunch pails. Frost rimed edges like lace. At the seam where darkness began, Duke stopped, looked up, and sneezed once. His tell for both relief and urgency. She clicked on her headlamp, checked the crowbar at her belt, and spoke his name the way soldiers say a blessing. He trotted forward and vanished into cool breath. Inside the air dropped and tasted like pennies and rain. Water trickled weight in the trickled from a fissure into a shallow pool, then ran along a rill toward lower chambers. Duke's pads landed without skids. Clara moved carefully, marking turns, right at a white vein, left at a fallen stone trickled and slab and deslab, and straight beneath a fern frozen into crystal. Prince ahead told a story of displacement. One adult with a deliberate stride, 2 small ones keeping pace because they trusted the guide. They reached a junction where gusts twisted. Duke paused, lifted his head, and listened. A faint thrum came from the left, a vibration more than a sound. He chose it, and she followed. The passage narrowed, then opened into a cathedral of stone scattered with crates, an altar block abandoned long ago and candles burning in a respectful line. Wax lacquered the top in rings like growth marks. The air trembled with voices. The girls stood before the block with quilts around their shoulders. James faced them, hands raised as if blessing a meal. He had arranged a tableau, a cross of oak, a cup, a handbell, hymn sheets propped bluz, Andy a stone, the lantern set back to flatter shadows. The opening bars slid from the girls in unison, drilled until muscle owned them. Nearer my God to thee. The words climbed, haloed by echoes that turned 2 voices into a choir. Ellie's tone carried innocence. Ava matched pitch with practice stone and duty. Clara stayed in darkness, counting beats while her mind ran outcomes. No weapon shop, ractest weapon was known. Weapon was shown. The girls were pale but unhurt. The lantern's fuel would hold. The candles could topple if panic broke the frame. The altar's edge looked heavy enough to punish a stumble. She toggled the radio to whisper, gave her location, and told the team to hold. Duke waited, vibrating with purpose, eyes on the twins, head low. He breathed their names without sound. James closed his eyes and lifted the bell. Lord, he said, voice roughened by cold and conviction. Waters rose again, and we moved to higher ground. Keep your chosen in your palm. He rang once, a clear note that hung like ice. Duke released a small sound, a thread that cut Clara straight through. The twins turned at the noise, and something old stirred in their eyes, recognition that bypassed indoctrination because scent travels a road doctrine cannot rewrite. Ellie whispered a name she did not know she remembered. Ava blinked hard, then gripped her sister's sleeve. Grandpa, Ellie asked, why does he feel like home? James faltered. The bell wobbled. Because we are saved together, he said, trying to mask fear with scripture. The world above is still drowning. We wait.
Clara stepped into the lantern's edge with palms open, and a voice tuned to calm skittish horses and frightened children. "Ava, Ellie, my name is Clara. Your mom is alive. She never stopped looking." She let those sentences fill the chamber like air. The flood story isn't true. Snow fell, time passed, people who love you searched every day. James lifted a hand. "Stay back," he warned, not with anger, but with brittle certainty. "This is sanctuary. God closed the door on the ark." "God doesn't close doors to mothers," Clara answered, eyes on the girls, not the man. "He doesn't call a lie a lesson. He doesn't need children underground to prove faith." She nodded toward Duke. "He found you because he remembers. He remembers because you loved him first." The hymn thinned. Ellie slid one foot toward Duke. Ava looked between James and Clara, caught in maps that did not match. She studied faces the way children do when survival depends on it. Duke held still, offering warmth without demand. Clara lowered to one knee, bringing her head below their chins so they could look down and choose. "Back," James said, but it sounded like a plea to himself. He glanced at the cross and the bell, at the candles that turned stone golden, at the altar lending weight to his story. He had believed the tableau more than truth. For a breath he seemed to beg the room to rescue him from the pivot he could not bear. Boots whispered behind Clara, as two deputies arrived and took positions where they could block an exit without crowding the children. She kept her hands open. "James," she said gently, "you built a place to hold sorrow. It cannot hold them anymore. Walk away with your hands visible. Let light finish what love started." Tears glazed his lashes. He set the bell on the altar as if laying down a relic that had carried him too far. For a moment his shoulders squared in an old pastoral habit, then slumped as memory outran doctrine. He lowered his hands. "Knees and girls," he said, voice thinned by surrender. "Go with the lady." Ellie moved first, pulling her quilt like a cape, stepping toward Duke, who met her with a chuff saved for homecomings. Ava followed, keeping a hand on Duke's neck, grounding herself in heat and heartbeat. "Are you really from Mommy?" Ellie asked, eyes wide, still ready to bolt if the script flipped back. "Yes," Clara said, "and she wants Coco, and your braids, and every drawing." Their mouths trembled, then steadied. Duke guided them around a puddle and toward the safer side of the chamber. Deputies eased forward and secured James without force, letting cuffs click like punctuation rather than struggle. Candles sputtered in a draught. Girls, and righted themselves. The altar looked less like a holy object now, and more like a block of stone in a hole in the earth. The lantern flickered and steadied. Air shifted as if the cave had exhaled. They trusted the wrong man for 4 years. Comment if Duke is the real hero. Clara radioed that she had the children, and that the route was clear. She wrapped her coat around Ava, tucked Ellie's quilt tighter, and let Duke lead. At each bend he checked back, eyes bright, tail level, paws placing confidence exactly where fear wanted to slip. The cold outside would sting, lights would flare, cameras would wait, and a siren would sob again, this time because relief can sound like grief. The path upward felt steep and right. At the mouth the sky opened like a curtain, and wind poured through the gap with the wild clarity of truth. Duke paused there, turned to the girls, and wagged once as if asking a question older than language. Ava slid her fingers into his ruff. Ellie pressed the rabbit to her cheek. Together they nodded. Clara exhaled a breath she seemed to have been holding for 4 winters, and started them toward the glow of cruiser light beyond the rim. Footprints printed the climb in a patient ladder. Child, dog, woman. At the ridge, barn stars winked faintly beyond town, and the church bell shivered in the wind like a throat clearing before speech. Clara touched her radio and spoke Lydia's name with a steadiness earned in hard rooms. Then she looked down at Duke and said, softly, "Take us home."
Headlines rolled across continents before the ambulance cleared the ramp, turning a hospital driveway into breaking news and a working dog into a symbol. Morning shows cut from weather maps to runway footage, anchors leaning toward cameras while captions chased the shock. Canine Kane saves hundreds, sniffs out human bombs. Burnt Merce, and Thunk burnt nurses, and Thank smelt. Travelers along a lower third beneath a clip of the black-masked Malinois pacing beside his handler in hard London light. Pregnant smuggling ring dismantled, followed on tickers that refused to sleep, and int burnt nurses, and Thank burnt nurses, and Thankant into grids. Investigators, smelt nurses, and pylo-travelers nurses, Grotor and Cruz, all trying to explain how instinct met engineering, and refused to blink. Airport speakers kept their measured announcements, yet every gate seemed to carry a hush that remembered one dog's warning shaped like thunder. By noon, bouquets appeared at the snurses and curity desk, and someone taped a Han nurses and on card with a child's block un nurses, and Edders the thank said simply, "Door thank filled out you hero." Phone notifications stacked like snow, and strangers who had filmed panic now filmed relief, ordinary footsteps and hands being held. Grief for what almost happened mixed with gratitude for what did not, and Burnt the Day carried both without falling over. Cane wreck burnt smelt of the metal inside thank a has melting gar filled out that smell. Traveler's door. Div polish and rain. The ribbon settling against dense fur as flashes pulsed and speeches softened. Hard facts into shared courage. He didn't pose, he sat, blinked, licked Jackson Reed's knuckle, and kept his gaze steady the way sentries do when crowds want a bow. A bronze statue burnt. Thank went up near Terminal 5. Paw lifted, nose aiming into Dees. Melt invisible W travelers. Travelers smelt tuned for travelers thank. The trouble people miss. Traveler's door filled out. Stopped to photograph the figure and then turned phones toward the real nurses. And partner Y burnt licking past nurses. And denly quiet travelers in the way cat door. Hedrals make people whisper. Kidsless melt F treats. Travelers is kennel bronze filled out. Travelers little bags of biscuits tied with ribbon and notes written in shaky cursive. Handlers rationed the gifts and tucked spare tokens into a tin marked for rainy days. Mitten and thanks polished the nurses, and plinth each morning until the names cawed door out first. Travelers filled out light. Jackson never tried to smelt travelers claim a headline. He bronze filled stat travelers. Bronze seatments answered questions, corrected the spelling of the dog's name once, and steered every lens back to the animal that had heard what machines could not. Sleep came in broken water for a while, but a fame is melt or liar way to go. Thankins his boot told him the tide still answer filled out loyalty. Bronze travel filled out loyalty. He stopped by the statue after travelers, a lot or, tigadulta der first top bet, bronze bore, trav squares, and eller squares, and study top bore, he plaque. Kane sniffed sizes a uniform, bronze tup travelers, and flicked an ear as if approving the sculptor's guess. A boy asked whether heroes get tired. Jackson knelt and said yes, then added that real heroes keep going anyway. Elena lived behind new locks and careful calendars, learning safe routines with travelers, bronze names she could not share. The Ruppa squares, and Toms taught methods that filled out turned spirals into ladders, could filled out meant green things, then filled out bronzemen squares, and aim sounds, fine squares, bronzemen squares, and a fey, as if oceans listen. She planted rosemary on a windowsill and let sun squares, and warm her hands while tea cooled. A uniform, on a day gentle enough to traveler squares, and Dametree. Jackson visited a quiet, uniform, travelers flat with a view of chimney squares, a color, Nindy. He arrived without a uniform, travelers, a uniform, bronzemen squares, and a uniform, size color. Nindy arrived without a uniform, try without uniform, bronzemen squares, and a uniform, size color, sizes to practicing, and smiled like someone a uniform, practicing sizes to practicing color, practicing a language. They sat at the table while a kettle considered boiling. She described nightmares that fizzled at the moment of impact and how counting steadied dawn. He described how trains made Kane vigilant, though infant cries pulled him close until the tiny storm eased. At one point she reached across the wood and held his hand with a grip that said not thanks exactly, more recognition. Your dog, he begged them to save me, she murmured, and the room understood. He told her witnesses would be shielded, that the cast practicing would move and that choosing help the media had already saved people she practicing would necizes to act now. The media practicing, the media kept circling. Investigators followed money through shell charities and storage rentals, found procurement orders that bought chemicals with invented donors, and read emails dressed as clinic scheduling that hid rehearsals. Prosecutors stacked the media charges into a staircase, traffic conspiracy, and kinsizes too on the media fraud conspiracy, and pilots wrote letters about mid-air interventions carried out with calm hands behind blankets and steady voices over satellite links. Cabin crews added notes to track conspiracy, and dining binders that sack, remember a pinta, an eye conspiracy, and Heinz trust quiet, remember call early, conspiracy, and remember woe captains embraced ground teams on tarmac concrete while cameras tried to keep pace with relief. Kane returned to workdays dotted with short school visits between drills. He accepted pats, posed with classes, sniffed backpacks politely, and let first graders decorate a poster that early spelt courage with mismatched glitter letters. He wore a tiny paper crown for 1 minute, then shook it off and resumed professional dignity. Jackson stood aside while teachers explained that bravery can look like attention, that listening counts, spelt courage. Afterwards, and they walked the perimeter, and the dog paused by the nursery gate to check on a baby singing to a plastic giraffe. At Heathrow, the statue collected small altars by evening, tea lights, paper hearts, boarding stubs scribbled with gratitude afterwards, and toy bones left by families catching night flights. Cleaners kept the space bright without disturbing a single token. A retiree polished the bronze paw with a handkerchief whenever her bus arrived early, then sat nearby to watch arrivals with a face that had learned patience. Security teams updated playbooks and rehearsed the choreography of calm, not just the sprint of emergency. Online, loud theories sparked and faded, because people who had stood under glass and heard the first bark answered with remembered silence. Gate agents wrote clear paragraphs that will live in manuals. Paramedics posted checklists. Translators put courage into many languages without sanding away truth.
Nothing perfect, everything human, the way healing prefers. If animals are purer than humans, prove it. Tag a friend who needs this story. Share before YouTube takes it down. Headlines faded from front pages, yet conversations lingered in kitchens, staff rooms and late buses. People traded small promises, look up from screens more often, guide strangers without waiting to be asked, and thank workers whose names hide behind badges. Airports refreshed posters about trafficking, airlines updated debrief scripts, and community groups organized quiet classes on noticing without panic. None of it felt dramatic, which was the point. Ordinary vigilance, multiplied by millions, became the soft armor cities wear when memory does its work. Together, back at the kennel, Kane slept, dreamed, woke, and trotted to the door the moment footsteps sounded. Jackson clipped the lead, scratched behind one ear, and said, "Ready, partner." They stepped into weather that smelt like clean pavement and jet fuel, an ordinary scent that felt almost holy. Across the city, Elena stood in a community garden, touched rosemary that had doubled, and lifted her face into pale light without flinching. She breathed, counted leaves, named 3 distinct sounds, and believed herself present in a future no longer borrowed. A plane drew a white line across blue and kept going. Somewhere a porter picked up a paper heart and tucked it back where wind could not claim it. Somewhere a supervisor reminded a new hire to watch hands, listen for the silence inside noise and trust the dog. Stories faded, as all headlines do, yet the statue stayed, the metal gathered dust, and the team returned to shifts that look like every other day until they are not. Kane's paw pads healed, leaving faint pink crescents beneath fur that told a memory without words. Jackson saved the child's card in his locker. Elena kept a photograph of Rosemary and Sky on her phone. They did not trade vows or secrets, only kept moving forward, which might be the bravest form of gratitude. The city exhaled, the terminals breathed, and somewhere very near, a dog lifted his head at the softest change in the air, and listened again, always.
Snow lifted off Hawthorne's rim like smoke, while cruisers idled in a quiet ring, their beacons hooded to keep the night tender. Lydia's boots scraped limestone as she ran the last bend, breath pluming, eyes locked on 2 small figures wrapped in quilts, and a black and tan sentinel planted between them. The girls broke free, quilts flying like flags, and collided with her in a tangle that sounded like a lock clicking after a long winter. Lydia laughed, sobbed, kissed cold cheeks, then found Duke's ruff and whispered thanks into fur that smelt like snow, cedar, and memory. Clara stayed a step back, leash loose, hands ready for steadiness rather than possession. Deputies eased radios down. James lay nearby under watch, eyes shut, breath evening as glucose steadied him without excusing him. The church bell far off let the wind drag a single moan across the quarry, a sound that felt like a page turning. Lydia's fingers found a thin ridge beneath Duke's coat. Ava froze, eyes widening as if a candle had been lit inside her. "You were warm in the snow," she said. The line unlocked a hallway, a tree twinkling, a ribbon box, a tumbling pup, socks sliding on hardwood, cocoa steam, a vow breathed into silky ears. Keep them warm, find them fast, never forget. Duke leaned harder, chuffing softly, sinking his breath to theirs until panic loosened its grip. Clara knelt to bring her face level with small eyes. "Your mom's alive," she said, clear and measured. She never stopped looking. Both heads turned toward Lydia. "Mommy?" Ava and Ellie asked together, hope already building a bridge past every false map. "I'm here," Lydia said, and all 3 began laughing and crying at once, the beautiful noise of a storm that finally rained where it should. They loaded into a cruiser smelling of wool and clean paper. The town slid by in softened shapes, the diner's red halo, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks on her porch with a shawl clenched high, neighbors misneighbors pretending they weren't crying, us neighbors rying, and now plow is crying, and now plowdiddling with its blade lifted like a salute. Inside the station, blankets waited beside soup, crayons and tissues. A photo sat sea-scent, snowplow and a table, 2 giggling preschoolers in purple mittens, a puppy tail blurring across the frame's lower edge. Ellie pressed her cheek to Lydia's coat, and inhaled like someone relearning the weather of home. Ava touched the brass tag, and read the name with reverence. Clara gave only what puppy work required, then returned to the family. "You rewrote today," she told the girls. "When you stepped toward the dog, you chose your map." They nodded with the gravity of children who have stood at a hinge and moved the right way. She squeezed Lydia's shoulder, a promise that cooperation would be kind, that interviews would wait, and wath it, and that evidence would never eclipse healing. Inside, silence brightened instead of pressing down. Duke slept between chairs, nose on paws, eyes half closed, resting the way only guardians rest, every muscle quiet, every instinct awake. Occasionally he thumped his tail once, counting blessings rather than seconds. Clara stepped into the hall and checked the evidence, the purple mitten, the journal, the hymn list, the rules sheet, then looked back through the doorway. She thought of rooms grief had tried to colonize, and how love annexes them back with stubborn tenderness. When she faced the camera, she carried none of the jargon and all of the heart. Her gaze went straight through the lens to the stranger who needed permission to hope. Lydia Harper ran into that cave, and her daughters ran to her. 4 years, 1,1460 days, one bark changed everything, but here's what no one saw coming. Duke wasn't just any canine, he was the puppy Lydia gave the girls for Christmas 2018. He knew their scent from birth, he never forgot. So tell me in the comments, what would your dog do to find you? Drop their name below, and if this story broke you, smash like, turn on Be the Bell, and colonize hair with someone who needs hope. Because of some bonds, not even 4 years underground can break. I'll see you in the next one. Stay human. The tally light cooled. Lydia had dozed with a child on each shoulder, fortified by soup, proximity, and the steady drum of a familiar heart. A volunteer slid 2 braided ribbons onto the table, and drifted away, before gratitude could fix on a name. Outside, plows cleaned the main drag, leaving ribs of snow that would read as simple stripes by morning. For once the future resembled a road rather than a riddle. An officer tapped the frame. They're clear to go home for the night. Lydia pressed foreheads, one and then the other. The sisters woke cleanly, the way kids do when the dream and the room finally agree. They carried bowls to the bin, a ceremonial act that gave agency back to small hands. Duke rose, stretched, shook once, and nudged the door with his nose like a gentleman ushering guests. They walked to the lot as the eastern horizon bruised toward violet. Breath smoked, boots squeaked. Lydia buckled belts with the careful speed only mothers master. She checked hats, tucked blankets, kissed scalps, and clipped Duke's tether. He sat prim, gaze forward, tail at half-mast, posture declaring readiness that never pressures. Clara opened the driver's door and paused. "You know where I'll be," she said. "At Elmwood, with the warrant, with patience, with stubborn grace." Lydia's eyes said everything a thank you cannot carry. The engine turned. Warmth climbed from the vents. Ava cracked her window 2 fingers wide and offered the town a whisper. "We're going home." Ellie echoed it, equally certain. Duke cocked his head as if filing the line beside every command he had ever loved. Clara watched taillights tip the corner and vanish. She stood long enough to let quiet finish settling, then walked back inside to write the paragraph that would carry a case from miracle to maintenance. Morning would put names on forms, dates on logs, and signatures beneath affidavits. It would also put toast on plates, pencils in fists, ribbons in hair, and a dog at a kitchen threshold where he once napped under high chairs. There would be shouting sometimes, and doors closing too hard, and a storm of tenderness flooding hallways. Healing is not a line, it is a braid. Lydia would relearn sleep. The girls would unlearn tunnels. Duke would collect mail with ceremony, supervise couch forts, and refuse to leave bedrooms until dreams quieted. Before dawn fully unfolded, Clara sat in her car and poured 2 coffees from a thermos, setting the extra into the holder across from her out of stubborn love. She raised her cup toward the rear view, toward faces she carries even when they are gone, and then toward the new ones she has promised to guard. Steam rose and vanished. She smiled, small and sure as the sky beginning to pale. She started the engine, flipped on the heater, and turned toward Elmwood Lane, where a lawful key would meet a waiting door, and where a dog's bark had already rewritten the ending.